Arthur Vance never imagined a day would come when he would be deemed unworthy of a place among his own kin. Yet, that is precisely what transpired during the annual autumn gathering, held in his daughter Seraphina's newly acquired residence in Cypress Point. The air in the house was thick with the scent of opulence and impending winter. The heavy, buttery perfume of a colossal roast fowl, marinated in rosemary and thyme, wafted from the kitchen. Dishes of sugared tubers crowned with molten confectionaries were lined neatly on the marble counter, and a spiced pastry cooled near the grand bay window. This lavish spread was the realization of a dream Arthur had harbored since his boyhood, back when his family often subsisted on meager rations and day-old bread. But as Arthur stepped into the dining hall, a jarring detail caught his eye. 12 velvet-upholstered chairs were arranged perfectly around a massive, polished mahogany table, likely sourced from an exclusive furniture gallery. Each setting was impeccable, featuring matching silverware, linen napkins folded into precise geometric shapes, and meticulously inscribed name cards. Everyone had a dedicated spot, save for Arthur. His chair, if one could even dignify it with that title, was shoved against the pale, textured wall, adjacent to utility area and coat rack. It was conspicuously absent from the table itself, not even placed adjacent to the long edge, suggesting he was an inconvenience, an unexpected guest who had arrived without invitation. Initially, Arthur dismissed it as a simple oversight, offering a forced chuckle. He gestured toward a visible gap in the middle of the arrangement. "Where would you like me, kiddo?" "Right here, maybe, between your Uncle Silas and the matriarch." Seraphina turned to face him, her expression hardening. Her voice was sharp, possessing an edge that seemed capable of slicing through convivial silence that had suddenly descended upon the room. "Father, perhaps you shouldn't occupy a seat there," she stated flatly. "You simply do not deserve that seat." The room froze. Arthur swore he could detect the subtle sound of the simmering berry compote in the kitchen. His hand, scarred and calloused from decades of labor, nearly dropped the fork he was holding. His own daughter, the child he had once proudly hoisted onto his shoulders at the bustling provincial fair, was telling him, in front of the entire assembled family, that he was unwelcome at her table. He surveyed the room. His younger brother, Silas, shifted awkwardly in his chair, suddenly engrossed in the minutiae of his communication device. No one offered a word of defense. A suffocating tightness gripped Arthur's chest, making it difficult to draw a breath. He struggled to keep his voice level, masking the profound sting of the rejection. "What exactly do you mean? I don't deserve it. I am your father, Seraphina." She folded her arms, her lips pressed into a thin, unyielding line. "You have never truly been present, Father, not in the capacity you imagine. This occasion is predicated on family bonds, and sometimes family is defined differently than mere biology suggests." Her pronouncement struck him with the force of a physical blow. He instantly recalled his life's relentless grind. He had dedicated 32 years to the grinding machinery at the Grand Forge Automotive Facility in Sterling Heights. He remembered the exhausting 12-hour shifts, the obligatory weekends, and the constant overtime. His hands still bore the indelible etchings of machinery, scars that represented every hour spent battling rust and heat. Every ounce of that effort, every sacrifice, had been made for her advancement. It was all done so that she might secure a future, attend an elite university, and forge a life free from the backbreaking labor that had defined his. Now, she stood before him, suggesting that none of those sacrifices held any value. A fierce urge to simply walk out, to abandon her flawlessly manicured suburban dwelling with its oversized portico and freshly applied window treatments, seized him. Yet something in her gaze, a cold, practiced determination, as though the scene had been meticulously rehearsed, held him in place. It was then that he registered a subtle but damning detail that struck him with the impact of a fast-moving locomotive. All the name cards, without exception, were inscribed in her crisp, professional lawyer's script, all except his own. His was hastily scribbled, almost illegible, clearly done at the last possible moment as an afterthought. The realization solidified. This was not an accident involving a stray chair. This was a deliberate declaration, a profound statement of rejection. Arthur slowly lowered himself into the solitary seat pushed against the wall. his back facing the heap of winter coats. He struggled to swallow the dry, bitter lump that formed in his throat, attempting to suppress his rising humiliation. He could not, however, stop himself from gazing toward the empty space of the long table, the place where a chair should have been, the place where a father belonged. The dinner proceeded, punctuated by manufactured laughter and the clinking of delicate crystal. Arthur found his appetite completely vanished. Every morsel he attempted to ingest tasted like sterile ash. Serafina leaned across the expansive table, engaging her spouse in a spirited discussion about their latest bond rates and end-of-year bonuses, behaving entirely as if Arthur were invisible. Finally, she directed her attention toward him, her voice carefully projected for the benefit of all the assembled guests. Honestly, Father, Mother would have been the one who deserved that seat, not you. Arthur's hands began to shake beneath the table. His wife, Ilara, her mother, had been gone for 15 years, and the memory of her absence remained a painful fixture in his life. Now, his only daughter was proclaiming that she would prefer a ghost at her table to him. He carefully placed his glass down, the ice cubes rattling sharply against the rim. The words escaped him before he could temper them. You possess absolutely no comprehension of what I forfeited for your sake. The room achieved a state of absolute stillness. Forks were suspended midair. Serafina's practiced smile wavered, just for a fleeting second. In that moment of vulnerability, Arthur recognized that this was not merely disrespect, but the surfacing of a deeper, festering wound he hadn't perceived before. The silence after his statement was unbearable, hanging heavily like residual smoke following catastrophe. Serafina's fork remained frozen, and the relatives exchanged uneasy, furtive glances. She forced a brittle laugh, attempting to dismiss his comment. Father, you maintain employment, certainly. But Mother was the one who performed the actual work of raising me. You were barely present. That accusation was far more damaging than the first insult. Arthur hadn't simply worked. He had bled for decades. Those 32 years at the Grand Forge facility involved shifts so prolonged that he often found himself sleeping in the worn interior of his vehicle in the employee parking area. He recalled the astronomical expense of her legal studies at the Metropolitan Institute of Law. The tuition alone was 40,000 currency units per year. To cover the initial semester's required payment, Arthur had been forced to sell his prized possession, his old Atlas pickup truck, a vehicle he had meticulously restored with his own labor. He then spent the bitter Sterling Heights winters, often in temperatures dropping to -15 with snow piled high, commuting by municipal transit, because every solitary coin was funneled directly toward her academic success. Yet, none of that, apparently, was sufficient. She sat there, polished crystal glass clutched in hand, regarding him as little more than a bothersome phantom. Then, she introduced the next element of her calculated attack. She addressed the table, her voice amplified as if delivering the closing summation in a courtroom. You all perceive his actions as a sacrifice. He didn't even purchase the provisions for this meal. He has never genuinely contributed to this family in the way that requires true effort. Mother shouldered the authentic burden. Gasps rippled around the table. Nervous coughs were exchanged. Heads swiveled toward Arthur. He felt as if his entire working life was suddenly subjected to intense scrutiny. He desperately wanted to shout the raw truth, but his throat constricted. Instead, his mind drifted back to the sorrowful day Ilara, his wife, had passed. She had extracted a promise from him, to ensure their daughter would never lose sight of her humble origins. That promise was a catalyst for the decisions he'd made. It was why he established a legacy trust fund, and why he formally signed over the deed to their modest, 250,000-unit dwelling to Serafina. He had intended it as an ultimate expression of paternal devotion, a guarantee that she would always possess roots. Now, the house felt like a deadly armament he had foolishly handed her to use against him. And here was the critical detail none of the guests knew. Serafina had already begun honing that weapon. He focused on her comment, that casual slight about him never contributing. The pieces clicked into place. She wasn't merely attempting to revise history for the sake of appearances. She was constructing a legal pretext. He distinctly recalled overhearing her conversation with her husband last week, murmuring about the necessity of liquidating father's property to assist in covering their extensive bond payments. At the time, he'd rationalized it as a misunderstanding, but now, confronting her icy stare across the autumnal feast, the evidence aligned perfectly. The sheer humiliation felt like a fire in his chest. Serafina was not just showing him disrespect. She was actively preparing to obliterate his legacy. The other family members squirmed in their seats. Silas cleared his throat hesitantly. "Come on, Serafina. That's your father. He financed your education, didn't he?" Serafina responded with a dismissive shrug. "That constitutes his recollection of events. He might have signed a few papers, but Mother was the one who truly sacrificed. She preserved the integrity of this family." Arthur's jaw tightened in fury. He knew that she was perfectly aware that every financial transfer, every invoice, every late-night overtime shift had been his responsibility. But she also recognized that the only comprehensive evidence existed in old, neglected storage containers. Tax filings, account statements, redeemed instruments. Documents she undoubtedly assumed he had discarded years prior. Anger churned within him. Yet underneath it was a more profound, corrosive sorrow. The girl he had cherished, the one he had patiently taught to operate a bicycle in the cracked cement drive of their old house, was extinguished. She had been replaced by this cold stranger, who wore her face but spoke with venomous intent. He gripped his crystal glass tighter, his hand visibly trembling. His cousin, Leon, offered a look of quiet sympathy, but still, no one risked speaking in his defense. Finally, Arthur managed to produce a smile, a thin, bitter distortion of his lips. "Perhaps you are correct," he began, his voice low but clear and carrying. "Perhaps I was not present enough. Perhaps I was guilty of only working, and working. But here's the amusing part. Those endless nights at the facility, they inevitably generated paper trails." Serafina's eyes flickered nervously, just for a fraction of a second. She instantly masked it, taking a slow, smug sip of wine. But Arthur had witnessed the flicker. That brief instant of doubt confirmed everything. Her disrespect was not driven merely by old resentment, but by a deliberate fabrication of narrative. She was portraying him as an absent financial drainer, so that, when the moment arrived to appropriate his assets, she would have a self-justifying alibi. The magnificent roast fowl on Arthur's plate lay untouched. The rich gravy had congealed. The seasoned stuffing was cold. His appetite was completely gone, replaced by an acute sense of clarity. He stood up, his chair protesting the movement as it scraped against the polished wooden floor. The room stiffened. Every eye was fixed upon him. He looked directly into her eyes. "You retain the power to erase me using mere words. You may attempt to confine me to the peripheral corner of this room," Arthur stated, "but you do not possess the power to erase my actions, not the official documents, not the transaction records, and certainly not the accumulated proof." Serafina blinked rapidly, her cheeks beginning to flush. Her lips parted as if she intended to retort, but no sound emerged. In that precise moment, Arthur realized he had finally located the fissure in her facade. He collected his jacket, slipping it over his shoulders. He spoke quietly, yet loud enough for every relative to hear the full extent of his statement. "If you believe this evening was humiliating for me, simply wait until the winter solstice dinner." He paused. "That is when the truth is going to claim its rightful seat at the table." Arthur slept fitfully that night following the autumn gathering. His daughter's condemning words, "You do not deserve that seat," reverberated in his mind like a persistent, metallic hammering until he felt physically ill. By the time dawn arrived, he was seated at the modest kitchenette table of his rented apartment, cradling a mug of bitter coffee and staring at the stacks of dusty storage containers he had neglected for years. They were sequestered in the back corner of his wardrobe, marked with faint, black permanent marker. Receipts, filings, miscellaneous. Ilera, his wife, used to playfully mock him for preserving every single scrap of evidence. "One day, you'll be submerged beneath all that accumulated waste." She had laughed. Perhaps she was right, but this morning, those boxes did not feel like junk. They felt like ammunition. He pulled open the first container. A cloud of fine dust rose, and a distinct scent of aged paper filled the air. Inside were account statements, invoices for her education, and pay slips detailing his overtime hours, each item an irrefutable testament to his life's exhaustive sacrifices. He discovered the instruments he had directly remitted to the Metropolitan Institute of Law. 40,000 here, another 20,000 there. He even located the duplicate copy of the monetary instrument he had written after the devastating sale of his Atlas pickup, the single possession that had ever truly felt like his own. He had traded his personal freedom for the certainty of her future, and she now behaved as though it had never occurred. Buried beneath a collection of financial records, he unearthed something he had not considered in years: the original trust fund documentation. He and Alara had established it 15 years prior, when Serafina was still fully immersed in her legal studies. At the time, he believed he was guaranteeing her security. But as he meticulously reread the legal jargon, a cold realization swept over him. The document contained extremely specific clauses stipulating that she was restricted from touching the property except under precise conditions. Clauses that her little scheme involving the bank's bond department would unequivocally violate. The complete picture crystallized. She had not merely sought to embarrass him at the autumn gathering. She was laying the foundation to completely eradicate his existence from a shared familial history. If she succeeded in rewriting their past, convincing others that it failed to make true sacrifices, then her appropriation of the house, the final physical remnant tying him to Alara, would appear completely justified. But she had failed to account for his inherent stubbornness and his habit of archiving everything. Yet, he still couldn't entirely dispel profound emotional pain in his core. She was his blood, his only progeny. A part of him wrestled with the urge to simply destroy the documents, to concede the property and thereby retain some semblance of peace. Do not let her forget where she originated. Alara's whispered instruction haunted him. Was he truly honoring her memory by engaging in this legal conflict, or was he committing a final betrayal? The question tormented him as he continued flipping through the paperwork until he spotted another artifact: a printed electronic mail. He had forgotten he had saved it. It was penned by Serafina during her 3rd year of law school. In it, she expressed profound gratitude for him covering another staggering tuition invoice, admitting she had no idea how he managed a feat she had even solemnly promised that one day she would make him profoundly proud. And now, she stood in her immaculate kitchen, polished glass in hand, behaving as if those earnest words had never been spoken. His grief solidified into absolute resolution. She wished to erase him? Fine, but he would ensure that the truth remained indelible. He contacted an old acquaintance in the Grand Forge, a man who had transitioned into property law following a corporate restructuring. The lawyer owed Arthur a considerable favor. When Arthur detailed the situation, his friend whistled softly. If Serafina had indeed leveraged the asset in defiance of the trust conditions, she faced potentially severe legal repercussions, perhaps even outright fraud. But it will require concrete proof, the friend cautioned. Proof Arthur now possessed in overwhelming abundance. That weekend, he digitally copied every single document, every financial instrument, every tuition record, every communication. He meticulously assembled a ledger, so thick it barely clamped shut. Every page felt like a small, hard-won victory in reclaiming his dignity. However, the more he organized the evidence, the heavier his conscience became. He continually replayed the scene at the autumn gathering, her smug, superior look, her dismissive words. Mother deserved that seat, not you. Did he truly desire to dismantle her professional life, damage her reputation, or potentially sacrifice her freedom? She was his blood, but she had already consciously severed that tie, hadn't she? Sunday evening, Arthur poured himself a measure of aged liquor and sat in quiet contemplation, gazing at the massive ledger on his kitchenette counter. His telephone vibrated. A brief social media notification. Against his better judgment, he tapped the screen. There she was, Serafina, beaming in a photograph alongside her spouse. The caption read, "Monumental steps forward soon. Excited for the journey ahead." In the background of the image, spread across their kitchen island, Arthur recognized paperwork. His trust deed. A chilling realization washed over him. She wasn't merely preparing to initiate the erasure. She was already actively engaged in the process. He clutched the heavy ledger to his chest and whispered into the empty room. If she desires a protracted conflict, then the winter solstice dinner will serve as the opening battlefield. The winter solstice arrived more swiftly than Arthur anticipated. Fresh snow accumulated high along the perimeter walkways, and glittering lights adorned every neighboring residence. Families were gathering in warmly lit living areas. His own family's home, however, felt colder than the sharp frost outside. Arthur entered Serafina's house carrying a simple, unadorned leather binder beneath his arm. No one present knew its contents but him. The interior was meticulously styled, resembling a scene from a promotional holiday catalog. The hearth was blazing. Seasonal music drifted from a concealed sound system, and embroidered stockings hung ready. The dining table was once again set with perfect symmetry. 12 chairs shone beneath the elaborate overhead illumination, and, mirroring the previous gathering, Arthur's name card was sloppily inscribed and relegated to the extreme periphery. He registered the slight, but this time it failed to wound him. This time he was protected by a strong, resolute armor. Serafina greeted him with the overly confident, practiced professional smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Please, you could tend. Father, please ensure we avoid any histrionics this time. Agreed?" Her words were saturated with sarcasm, clearly intended to publicly undermine him before the customary opening celebratory drink. Arthur merely nodded. He deliberately placed his binder on a nearby utility stand, close to the illuminated hearth, and silently took his peripheral seat. The dinner commenced identically to the last. Careful carving of the bird, stilted small talk, and the delicate clinking of glassware. Serafina assumed the role of the consummate host, dominating the conversation and narrating anecdotes, controlling the room as if it were her personal courtroom. Then, halfway through the final course, she delivered her calculated disclosure. "We have determined to proceed with the sale of Father's old asset," she announced. "It's simply stagnating there, and frankly, I know Mother would have wholeheartedly supported me utilizing the funds constructively." A wave of audible gasps swept around the table. Silas's dessert fork froze. Leon muttered, "Wait, is she legally permitted to do that?" Serafina smiled serenely. "Absolutely. The ownership is recorded entirely in my name. Legally, it is mine to dispose of." This was the precise moment Arthur had been anticipating. He rose slowly, the heavy wooden chair groaning in protest against the floor. He walked deliberately toward the utility stand. His hands, this time, were steady. He opened a substantial binder, extracted a stack of neatly arranged papers, and placed them on the table's surface like a series of crucial playing cards in a high-stakes game. "It is rather humorous that you bring up legal ownership," Arthur stated, his voice remarkably calm, "because, according to the stipulations outlined in this trust agreement, you have systematically violated every single regulation that your mother and I put into place." Her composed smile fractured. "What utter nonsense are you referring to?" Arthur flipped to the highlighted clauses. "You were explicitly forbidden from leveraging the property as collateral for outstanding debt. Furthermore, you were expressly forbidden from selling it without my affirmative consent while I remained alive. You have knowingly breached both conditions." The room erupted in whispers. Relatives exchanged anxious glances. Serafina's husband squirmed uncomfortably in his seat. Arthur was far from finished. He produced the printed electronic mail she had sent while in law school, expressing her indebtedness for the tuition payments. "And concerning the matter of who financed your path, here are your very own declarations, Serafina, straight from your archived correspondence." Her complexion drained of all color. Blow after painful blow landed. The relatives who had previously regarded Arthur with simple pity now stared at Serafina with dawning suspicion. She opened her mouth, clearly intending to launch a counter-argument, but Arthur preempted her with the final, decisive card. "I recently held a meeting with a certified attorney," he explained. "A genuine legal practitioner, not just family." He confirmed that the situation constitutes fraud. Arthur paused, allowing the gravity of the word to settle. "If I proceed to file this in court, you will not only forfeit the property, but you will also likely forfeit your professional license to practice law." The stillness was palpable, thick enough to suffocate. His daughter, the celebrated, successful attorney, suddenly appeared like a cornered, frightened child. But then, she exhibited a reaction Arthur had not mentally prepared for. She laughed. A cold, sharp sound born of pure desperation. "You would never dare," she challenged. "You would destroy your only child? You would cause me to lose everything simply to make a point." Arthur's chest painfully tightened. This was a cruel twist he hadn't foreseen. The ethical knife she turned back upon him. He could feel the collective gaze of the room burning into his skin, waiting to observe if he would yield. Would he be the forgiving father, or the man who ruthlessly fought back? He stared intently at her, every one of his past sacrifices flashing through his mind. The solitary bus rides in the freezing snow, the sold pickup truck, his permanently callous hands, the countless empty nights without Alara. He contemplated the legacy trust, established with genuine love, now distorted into an instrument of malice against him. Arthur leaned in close, ensuring that every syllable reached her. "I did not destroy you, Serafina. You destroyed yourself the moment you made the decision to erase me." Her smirk finally vanished. Her husband abruptly pushed his chair backward, muttering something about stepping outside. He appeared genuinely shocked, perhaps only now grasping the full extent of Serafina's deceit. Another breach in her defense. Arthur slowly closed a heavy ledger, tucking it back under his arm. He scanned the table one last time. This conflict is not resolved. The winter solstice dinner was merely the initial opening argument. He walked toward the entrance. As he reached for his outer garment, he heard her voice, trembling for the first time that night. "Father, where are you going?" Arthur paused, his hand on the door latch, the exterior light casting a glow on the falling snow. To ensure that absolutely everyone knows precisely who truly deserves a seat at the table. With that, he stepped out into the biting winter night, leaving Serafina and the shocked family suspended in agonizing anticipation of his next move. The night he abandoned that winter solstice dinner, the snow crunching sharply beneath his boots, Arthur felt an internal tectonic shift. For the first time in years, he was not the supplicant begging for acceptance. He was a custodian of the truth. He spent the subsequent week collaborating with his lawyer friend, meticulously scrutinizing every single document again. The attorney often shook his head, remarking that Serafina had been reckless. She should possess enough legal knowledge to recognize that every clause within that trust was akin to a loaded firearm, and she had effectively pulled the trigger on herself. Yet, a part of Arthur still wrestled with the moral dilemma. She was his only child. Could he truly bear to destroy her career? The ultimate decision was abruptly taken out of his hands. On the eve of the new year, he received an official communication from the local county registrar, a formal notice of intent to legally transfer the deed ownership. The paperwork had been submitted by his daughter's legal firm, bearing her undeniable signature. She was not retreating. She was doubling down. That constituted the absolute final limit. Arthur filed the required petition the very next morning. The court date was set for late February. The courtroom ambience was heavy with a pervasive smell of stale coffee and industrial floor polish, the characteristic odor of government agencies. Arthur's hand briefly shook as he placed a heavy ledger onto the defense table, but his voice remained steady when the judge requested his testimony. He presented the trust agreement, the clear documented violations, the mortgage documents, and the damning electronic mails in which he had expressed gratitude for the tuition. Every piece of evidence aligned perfectly, like a set of falling dominoes. Her retained counsel attempted a strategic maneuver, characterizing Arthur as an emotionally absent father and arguing that the fundamental intent of trust was sufficiently flexible. However, the presiding judge's focus remained fixed on the fraudulent filings and the undeniable breach of established terms. Then came the final, shocking development. Arthur's attorney presented a printout sourced directly from the bond institution, an email Serafina had dispatched using her firm's official letterhead, containing the false claim that she possessed singular, sole control over property. Fraud, starkly displayed in black and white. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Serafina's husband, seated just 2 rows behind her, buried his face in his hands. When the gavel struck the bench, the verdict was unambiguous. The property was immediately reverted to Arthur Vance. All previous transactions were officially nullified. Worse for Serafina, the judge formally referred the entire case to the State Professional Review Board for a comprehensive ethical investigation, a move tantamount to a career death sentence for a legal professional. Arthur did not allow himself to smile, not as he watched her composed face disintegrate, the confident professional mask shattering into an expression of raw panic and shame. He felt no sense of shallow victory, but rather something far weightier, the crushing burden of the aftermath. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Serafina lost her prestigious position at the legal firm within weeks. Her husband filed for formal separation, unable to withstand the financial devastation and public notoriety. The luxurious suburban residence she had been so intensely proud of quickly slipped into foreclosure proceedings. And Arthur? He retained the old dwelling, the property inextricably tied to Alara's memory, not because he had any practical need for it, but because it was undeniably his. It stood as irrefutable proof that his contribution, his life, had not been successfully erased. Months later, one quiet Sunday, Arthur stood inside that now empty house. The original floorboards creaked exactly as they had years ago, back when he and Alara carried their sleeping daughter to bed after late evenings watching animated programs. He ran his hand across the banister, whispering softly, "She cannot take this from me." For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the profound silence within the walls felt like genuine peace, rather than a ceaseless punishment. The profound truth remains: revenge does not possess the power to mend everything. Serafina is still out there, consumed by anger and profoundly broken, and Arthur accepts he cannot fix that damage. However, what he successfully recovered was his essential dignity. He reclaimed his rightful seat at the metaphorical table, regardless of whether she ever extends him another invitation. If a single principle could be extracted from this ordeal, it is unequivocally simple. Silence grants others the opportunity to completely rewrite your personal history. Sometimes, the only viable means to honor yourself and the memories of those you have lost is to articulate the stark, painful truth, regardless of the ultimate cost.